Good morning, sixth grade. So we're going to continue with chapter 25, lesson 3 today. So allies win the war. We did our resources yesterday, and you should have already watched the opening video. So let's go ahead and get started on the reading.
Lesson 3. Allies win the war. It matters because an Allied victory over the Axis states was necessary for the survival of American and European democracies. The global struggle. Guiding question. How did the Allies gradually push back Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II? World War II was a conflict fought on an enormous scale. On one side were the Allies, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. On the other side were the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The war was fought in two major theaters, or battle areas, Europe and the Pacific. Winning battles required outstanding leaders and hundreds of thousands of troops. At home, civilians worked hard to provide resources and goods for the war. War in Africa and Europe. The Allies developed a war strategy, or plan of action, for fighting the Axis powers. Allied leaders Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt decided to focus first on defeating Hitler. They would turn their attention to Japan later. This plan became known as the Europe First policy. Stalin wanted the British and Americans to attack Nazi-held Western Europe. Churchill, however, argued that the Allies were not yet ready to fight strong German forces in Europe. He wanted to attack the edges of the German-held territory, and Roosevelt agreed. At the end of 1942, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Moving swiftly eastward, they joined British forces advancing west from Egypt to close in on the Germans. In May 1943, the Allies drove the Germans out of North Africa. Allied troops then advanced into southern Europe. They took the Italian island of Sicily in the summer of 1943 and landed on Italy's mainland in September. U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower directed the invasion. Another American general, George Patton, and British General Bernard Montgomery actually led the troops. As the Allies advanced, the Italians overthrew Mussolini and surrendered. German forces in Italy continued the fight, but could not halt the Allied move into central Italy. In June 1944, Allied forces finally entered Rome, Italy's capital. While the British and Americans fought in North Africa and Italy, the Soviets battled the Germans on Soviet territory. In the spring of 1942, German forces advanced on Stalingrad, an industrial city in southeastern Russia. Soviet troops fought back and surrounded the city, cutting off German supply lines. Several months later, in February 1943, the Germans surrendered. The German defeat at Stalingrad marked a major turning point in the war. Meanwhile, Allied leaders made plans for the world for after the war was over. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin convened in Tehran, the capital of Iran, in late 1943. At this Tehran conference, the leaders agreed to divide up Germany after Hitler was defeated. Stalin also agreed to help the United States defeat Japan and to join an international peacekeeping organization after the war. War in the Pacific. While war raged in Europe, the Allies fought Japan in the Pacific. By mid-1942, Japan had driven American troops out of the Philippines and seized many Pacific islands. The United States, however, soon recovered. In June 1942, American forces won a major sea and air battle at Midway Island. This battle stopped the Japanese advance and changed the course of the Pacific War in favor of the Allies. During the next 3 years, U.S. commanders in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, carried out a plan called island hopping. This plan called for attacking certain key Pacific islands. The United States then used these islands as stepping stones for moving closer to Japan. By 1945, the Americans had recaptured the Philippines and destroyed much of Japan's Air Force and Navy. As American forces closed in on Japan itself, the Japanese military fought to keep the Allies from reaching their homeland. Progress check. Contrasting. How was the war in Europe different from the war in the Pacific? The Holocaust. Guiding question. Why is the Holocaust considered a dark chapter in human history? During World War II, Hitler and the Nazis set up a program of genocide, or the killing of an entire group of people. As many as 6 million Jews were killed in what has become known as the Holocaust. Millions of others, including Slavs and Roma, or Gypsies, were also ruthlessly murdered. The Nazis believed that the Jews were a threat to the racial purity of the superior German people. The Nazis also targeted other groups that they thought were inferior. Nazi persecution of the Jews. Beginning in the 1930s, Nazi laws had taken away the personal and political rights of the German Jews. On the night of November 9, 1938, the Nazis burned synagogues, destroyed Jewish shops, and killed many Jews. About 30,000 Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. Because the Nazis had shattered the windows of so many Jewish shops, this event became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. During World War II, the Nazis mistreated the Jews in the lands they conquered. They forced Jews to wear a 6-pointed yellow star on their clothing. In Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were crowded into ghettos, areas set aside for them in cities and towns. Eva Geller, who survived the Holocaust, describes life in the ghetto of Lubitzow, a town in Poland. Primary source. The ghetto was the size of one city block for 7,000 people. We slept 28 people in a room that was 12 by 15 feet. It was like a sardine box. People lived in attics, in basements, in the streets, all over. It was cold. We were not given enough to eat. There was not enough water to drink. Every day, a lot of people died. The death camps. The Nazis began the mass killing of Jews when the German army invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Special Nazi forces accompanied the army. They sought out Jews, gathered them together, shot them, and dumped their bodies into mass graves. In January 1942, German leaders agreed on what they called the final solution to destroy the Jews. Nazis rounded up millions of Jews and hundreds of thousands of other innocent people in the areas under their control. Crammed into railroad cars like cattle, the prisoners were taken to death camps, such as Auschwitz in Poland. At the camps, many people were killed in poison gas chambers.
Others were worked to death or died of starvation. Still others were victims of cruel medical experiments performed by Nazi doctors. At war's end, Allied forces moving into Nazi-held areas saw firsthand the unspeakable horrors of the death camps. About 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population perished in the Holocaust. The Holocaust had an impact on the world after World War II. The consequences of Nazi brutality made people aware of the importance of defending human rights and combating prejudice. Governments and international organizations also began to work to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. The inability of Jews to find shelter from Nazi terror increased demands for the Jews to have their own country in Palestine. Christians and Jews began to move toward greater understanding and cooperation. Reading progress check. Analyzing. Why do you think the Holocaust was a world human rights issue? Ending the war. Guiding question. What actions did the Allies take to win the war? While the Holocaust was taking place, the Allies were focused on defeating the Axis countries. By 1944, the Germans and Japanese were retreating everywhere. The Allies were now preparing to invade Germany and Japan. What was D-Day? For months, Allied forces under General Eisenhower had been preparing to invade Nazi-held France. June 6, 1944, was D-Day, the day of the invasion. Ships left Britain carrying troops and equipment across the English Channel to the French province of Normandy. When the battleships arrived at Normandy, their guns pounded German positions on shore. Meanwhile, Allied soldiers were transported from the ships to the beaches. There, they fought their way through German machine gun fire. Despite heavy German resistance, the invasion was a success. Within a few weeks, 1 million Allied soldiers had landed in France.
From Normandy, the Allies launched an attack against the Germans. By early August, U.S. General Patton and his tanks were racing through northern France, while General Montgomery's British troops moved along the coast into Belgium. Pressured on all sides, the German forces retreated, and on August 25th, French and American soldiers entered Paris. In December 1944, however, the Germans counterattacked in Belgium. German troops advanced, pushing back the Allied lines and creating a bulge. The attack later became known as the Battle of the Bulge. After weeks of fighting, the Americans won the battle and then moved into Germany. By late 1944, the Soviets had driven the Germans out of Russia and across Poland. In February 1945, Soviet troops arrived on the outskirts of Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. The Germans surrendered on May 7th, ending the war in Europe. The atomic age begins. By the end of 1944, an Allied victory over Japan seemed certain. In October, General Douglas MacArthur regained the Philippines. Then, in early 1945, American forces defeated the Japanese in bloody battles on the Pacific islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. With most of the Japanese Air Force and Navy destroyed, American bombers began pounding Japanese cities. In desperation, the Japanese sent suicide pilots, known as kamikazes, against the Americans. The kamikazes crashed planes loaded with explosives into American ships. Despite setbacks, Japan's military leaders refused to surrender. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died, and Harry S. Truman became president. Truman faced a difficult decision. Should he risk the lives of American troops by invading Japan? Or should he use the newly developed atomic bomb, in hopes it would end the war? Since 1941, American engineers and scientists had been building an atomic bomb at a secret laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The atomic bomb program was called the Manhattan Project. American officials disagreed about using such a powerful weapon. Some opposed its use because it would kill thousands of Japanese civilians. Others wanted to warn the Japanese about the bomb. The final decision rested with Truman. He believed it was his duty to use every weapon available to save American lives. He demanded that Japanese leaders surrender unconditionally. The Japanese did not respond, and Truman ordered the use of the bomb. On August 6, 1945, a plane named the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Between 80,000 and 120,000 people were killed in the explosion. Thousands more died afterward from burns and radiation sickness. 3 days later, another American plane dropped a second bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki. It killed between 35,000 and 74,000 people. Faced with such destruction, the Japanese government surrendered on August 15, 1945. Effects of the war. More than 70 million people fought in World War II. The casualties were enormous. Altogether, more than 55 million people died during the war. These included 22 million Soviets, 8 million Germans, 2 million Japanese, and 300,000 Americans. In addition to the human losses, World War II was the most expensive war in history. Some experts claim its financial cost would be equal to about $4.1 trillion today. Because of the use of deadly new weapons, World War II was also the world's most destructive conflict. The war also led to a dramatic change in the world's balance of power. Britain, France, Germany, and Japan ceased to be great military powers. In their place arose two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Another effect was a greater commitment to world peace. Even before the war ended, the Allies had started a world organization. In April 1945, representatives from 50 countries drew up a charter for the United Nations, UN. The UN Security Council, part of the UN's General Assembly, would investigate international problems and propose settlements. War crime trials were also held. Between November 1945 and September 1946, Nazi leaders were tried at Nuremberg, Germany, for pursuing aggressive war and for committing crimes against humanity. Similar trials took place in Japan. As another response to war crimes, the United Nations drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This declaration set forth in detail the rights and freedoms of individuals. It also marked the first time the international community had recognized this issue. Progress check. Explaining. Why did President Truman decide to drop atomic bombs on Japan?